All right. Well, welcome to the Portland, Oregon chapter gathering of Reasons to Believe. And this is June 25th, 2022. We are a science and faith organization. And as a chapter of RTB, we make every effort to help people discover that sound reason and scientific research consistently affirm the truth of the Bible and the good news it reveals. Today is part one of our two-part apologetic series by our very own Dr. Paul Lorenzini, Portland chapter member and RTB visiting scholar. He is presenting on a Christian apologetic for 21st century America. Part two will be on July 9th. Also an invitation to an 8-week summer study, Bridging the Gap, where medical science and church meet, a Christian Medical and Dental Association curriculum. I'll be doing those on Thursdays beginning July 14th. Topics include issues on beginning of life, end of life, sexuality, gender, right of conscience, and addictions. Registration is required, it's free, but please see our newsletter or email me at rtb.portland.or@gmail.com. Following the presentation, we will have an interactive Q&A, so you'll be able to ask your questions directly, or if you prefer, you can type it in the chat. All right, I am honored to introduce our guest and speaker, Dr. Paul Lorenzini. Dr. Lorenzini graduated from the U.S. Merchant Marine Academy, earned a PhD in nuclear engineering from Oregon State University, and a law degree from Loyola Law School. He began his career with Atomics International, a division of Rockwell International. In 1984, he headed a 5,000 person operation at the Hanford nuclear site in Eastern Washington. In 1987, he joined Pacific Corps, serving in several executive management positions, including CEO of Pacific Corps Turkey and CEO of Pacific Corps Australia. In 2007, he co-founded a company called New Scale Power. He has served as a trustee at the Oregon State University Foundation Board and currently serves on the OSU Board of Regents for the Honors College. In 2002, he was inducted into the Oregon State University Engineering Hall of Fame. He is also active in the Kairos Prison Ministry International. A student of Francis Schaeffer and Charles Taylor, he has taught on how history has influenced and shaped America's thoughts and behavior, and on being a Christian in the 21st century. He teaches a colloquium in the OSU Honors College, as well as George Fox University. He is a visiting scholar for RTB and has several articles on the website, including Christian Environmentalism in an Age of Bobos, It's Okay to be an Exclusivist, and is supernatural causation compatible with science. It's my great honor to welcome Paul Lorenzini. And again, Paul, thank you for virtually being here with us in Portland, Oregon. I'm actually not sure where you are in Oregon.
I'm in Camas. I'm not in Oregon.
Yeah, I think he's in Vancouver.
I'm in the tax-free part of Oregon.
Ah, okay. Well, welcome.
Yeah, well, so thank you, Belinda. So this is basically a distillation of a class that I'm teaching at George Fox. It's 15 weeks, 2 hours a week. So there's a lot that's packed into this. And I want to thank Belinda for helping me pack it. I've gone through this a couple of times with her, and she's been incredibly helpful to me in structuring this. I'm not going to blame her for this, but I do want to give her credit for how much she's helped me. In this first section, I want to focus on what I've called Where the Battle Rages. And that comes from this quote from Martin Luther, which is, it appears at the front of one of Francis Schaeffer's books, but he's got this thought here. You know, if I profess in the loudest voice every portion of the truth of God, except precisely the point at which the world is attacking, I'm not professing Christ, however boldly I may be professing Christ. Where the battle rages, the loyalty of the soldier is proved. And so what we want to focus on today is in our age, in our culture, today, right here in River City, where does the battle rage? What are the points of attack that we need to understand if we're going to advocate and defend our faith? And in doing that, there are really two aspects. The central part of it is we need to understand the culture and its challenges to Christianity. That's sort of basic to the whole idea. But before we do that, we need to stop and think about what we mean by being Christian. It's not a simple question in the sense that there's all kinds of expressions of Christianity. People look at Christianity from the outside and they see all these denominations, they see Catholic, Protestant, fundamentalist, and so forth, and they get confused. And frankly, it's important for us as Christians to get our head around the idea of, with all that diversity going on, what's the unity? What binds us together? Alvin Planting from Notre Dame puts it this way. He asked the question, what unites Calvin and Luther and Augustine and Barth and all these other Christians around central Christian beliefs, as we might call it? What is it that unites us? What's helped me answer that question has been my participation in this prison ministry called Kairos. In Kairos, we go into the prison. This is Ironwood State Prison along the border in Southern California. By the way, if you look at those signs up at the top here, one of the signs says, no warning shots fired in this area. So immediately when you move into this environment, you know you're in a different space. So we come in with maybe 20 guys, and here you can see 42 inmates. We organize the inmates in families. So on day 2, we'll sit down, and everyone will be at their own table, their own family. We'll have 2 outside guys, maybe 5 or 6 inside inmates, and they stay together during the course of the weekend. It goes from Thursday night to Sunday, and what you can see here is one of the things we do is we mix Blacks, Hispanics, and whites together at a table, which is not what they do inside the prison. And so we force them to get together and to interact with each other. But what happens during the course of this 3 or 4 days is they come in, and you can see this like day 2, day 3, because they've all got smiles on their face. When they first come in, they've all got their hardened Christian prison face on. Who are you guys? What's this about? And you have to break that down. Long about day 3, day 2, day 3, they start to break. And sometimes somebody will come along and say, I want this. I want to accept Christ. I want Christ to be in my life. And so footnote here, when we come in as Catholics, Baptists, Presbyterians. We've got all kinds of different Christian faiths in here, but we all profess Christianity. So when we get to this point where somebody says, I want Christ in my life, we don't stop and we say, well, before we can do that, what's your view of young earth versus old earth? Or what's your view of the rapture or the millennium? We don't ask those questions. We just simply say, do you believe Jesus died for your sins? Do you believe there's a God there? Do you believe you're a sinner? Do you believe you need redemption? Are you ready to accept Christ for the atonement of your sins? And they say yes. And it's as simple as that. And for me, we're all gathered together, in spite of our diversity, we're all gathered together around those basic, simple truths. So when we talk about Christianity and its unity, that's the kind of Christianity that we're talking about. And it's all of us together. So when we think about it, that those truths are captured in creeds. We've got the Apostles' Creed, we've got the Nicene Creed, and there are basic truth claims that we make. A personal infinite God exists. Jesus was divine and rose from the dead. We're fallen sinners. And the authority of Scripture exists as God's vehicle for communicating truth to us about himself. So when you say that, one of the difficulties is not every professing Christian agrees with those premises, with those truth claims. Ken Samples refers to them as apostasies. And these are people who profess Christianity, but they reject these essential truth claims: His Trinity, the deity of Christ, the atonement, the resurrection. So one of the challenges that we have is not just how we defend and identify ourselves as Christians in the community of the secular community, if you will. It's also understanding who we are in relation to other people who profess Christianity and being willing to draw lines around what we mean by Christianity, to defend what we mean by Christianity, and to defend our faith. So having said that, if you think about, okay, so where does the battle rage? Well, one way the battle rages is one we're familiar with. It's the whole idea of reasons to believe. There's an assault on Christianity from people who look at the world through the prism of secular science. Science has disproven Christianity. We all know that in view of modern science, Christianity is no longer credible. And so that's one whole body of challenge to Christianity that we experience in our modern age. There's a second source, however, that's different. It's newer, it's more recent, it's on the spiritual side, and it doesn't conform to a secular science view of the world, but rather it approaches the whole issue of religion from a perspective of spiritual pluralism. Everything counts. It's all equally legitimate, and it's an attack on Christianity in a different way, because what it's basically saying is we accept being religious, being spiritual, having all these different spiritual experiences, but we aren't willing to say that orthodoxy is true. And they actually assault orthodoxy because they see orthodoxy as a threat and a challenge to their ideas of spiritual pluralism. So what we want to do is we want to focus on these two sort of thrusts and understand a little bit about their history so we can understand what they are. Under the force of these two assaults, which are fairly recent, America has become what you might call an alien land. Now, this is a cover of Newsweek from about 10 years ago, The Decline and Fall of Christian America by John Meacham. And I think people are recognizing that in today's America, Christianity doesn't have the place it used to have, and it's under attack. And it's under attack in the sense of its credibility is being questioned. And so you see this, one indicator is the rise of the nuns. And we've all seen this chart. We all know that the nuns are going up. Something is going on out there, and it's reflecting a drift away from Christianity. Well, it wasn't always the case. So this is from a book by two sociologists, Robert Putnam and David Campbell. And they go back and they say, if you look at America prior to the 60s in the 1950s, it was a very religious place. Most Americans expected that trend to continue. 69% of Americans told Gallup pollsters religion is increasing its influence on American life. Now, for those of us that are long of tooth and who grew up during the 50s, we're very familiar with what this meant. You go back to the 50s, and it was taken for granted that you're a Christian. If you worked in a big corporation, you were expected to be seen in church on Sunday as part of, demonstrating, your ethical stance, if you will, inside the company. I can even remember a kid in the locker room getting bashed around a little bit because he was an atheist, and that just was unacceptable. So it was a different culture and a different climate. And America was a place where it had a Christian history, and everybody sort of understood that Christianity was true. Well, the decade of the 60s changed all of that. This is a quote from a historian, Sidney Alstrom, and this is dated like 1970. So he's looking at this currently, and he says the decade of the 60s was when old foundations, even historic Christian theism, were awash. This is from another study of the 60s. It says nothing changed so profoundly in the United States during the 1960s as American religion. Charles Taylor, who I'm going to introduce in a little bit, calls the 60s a hinge moment. And it's a great metaphor because you sort of imagine a door rotating on a hinge, and you can sort of see America as going from this pre-60s condition to something post-60s, where the change was really dramatic in a very short period of time. So going back to Putnam and Campbell, they dubbed the 60s, they call it a spiritual earthquake. The 60s earthquake resulted in a rapid decline in religious observance. Within barely a decade, expectations that religion was increasing its influence in American life would be utterly overturned. Now, you remember in the pre-60s, 1957, the poll said 69% said religion was increasing its influence. Here, by 1971, that had bottomed out, as they put it, at 14%. So it was utterly overturned, in their words. They conclude, this is a really I think, summary statement. Almost overnight, it seemed, America had turned from God's country to a godless one. Now, what does that mean? Well, godless how? So this is the front page, the cover of a famous essay by Frank McCourt in 1996. When you think of God, what do you see? And he basically says, wait a minute, America is as religious as ever. Well, what does that mean? Well, it means America's God is no longer the Orthodox God. It's vaguely defined, many different views of God. Sometimes God's plural, sometimes exalted being, sometimes a plane of consciousness. So we had not become unreligious. We had just changed our understanding of what being religious meant. Excuse me. So if you go back to the 60s, you say, well, okay, so what happened in the 60s? How do we understand it? Well, if you try to read about the 60s, you can get all bogged down in these details. And there's tons of books on the 60s, Vietnam, civil rights, the new feminism, the Black Panthers, the Weather Underground, hippies, music, all that stuff gets talked about. The real question is, how do you understand if you want to understand the 60s, you have to put all of that stuff in some kind of a historical context. Now, I mentioned when we talked a couple of weeks ago, Francis Schaeffer. I know many of you are familiar with Francis Schaeffer. That's his picture there on the right. Francis Schaeffer was very popular during the 1970s because as all these changes were going on and as Christians were trying to understand what was going on, he brought this historical perspective to the picture. And he used the historical picture to help Christians understand what was changing and how it was changing. And he drew everything back to trends that had been going on in Western thought, going all the way back to the Enlightenment. You can see Eternity Magazine called him an evangelical phenomenon. He's been compared to C.S. Lewis. The problem with Schaeffer is he was very, very good, but nobody outside of Christian circles knew who he was. I talk about Francis Schaeffer to scholars, and they just draw a blank. There's a glaze over their face. But more recently, we've got a book by Charles Taylor that was published in 2007 called A Secular Age. Kind of long, 776 pages. Like Schaeffer, he makes the argument that if we want to understand our secular age, we have to understand it in the context of all of this history. What makes him different is that he's recognized in scholarly circles. You've got scholars on the secular side and scholars on the theological side, both of whom respect what he has to say. And so what that does for me is it allows me to draw on an authority for what we want to say in describing our secular age that is respected on both sides of the aisle. Now, from the theological side, this is from a book published by this guy, Colin Hansen. It's a series of 10 essays by Christian pastors, and he's got this one really interesting statement at the very beginning. He says, probably no book published in the last 10 years has been so formative in my thinking and ministry as The Secular Age. Then on the other hand, you've got this quote from Robert Bellah, who's also a well-known sociologist, calling it among the most important books I've ever read. So this is from a review of the book in the New York Times with David Brooks. He makes the point, he starts off, everybody's talking to me about Charles Taylor's The Secular Age, there's conferences, there's symposiums, but it's almost invisible outside the academic world because the text is nearly 800 pages of dense jargon-filled prose. And so, and you hear this coming from theologians who will say, this was really an important book, but how do I create some access to what he's got to say for people outside the circle who haven't been willing to wade through this 800-page book. So what I hope to do here is not necessarily summarize everything he said because there's a lot to it, but I want to pick on a couple of things he said that I think are really important to us, that are helpful to us in shaping our thinking about where we stand in our current age. And I think there are two significant things that he contributed to change the narrative that is a common narrative that we take for granted. The first is we think of the Enlightenment as a time when God was rejected because science came along and it just crowded out God. He says that is not what happened. He says, rather, we were motivated by a new sense of self. So we want to talk about what that's about. Then the second thing is when you start looking at this whole new mode of spiritual pluralism that attacks in a different way, that is anchored. When you want to understand what that's about, that is anchored in a period right after the Enlightenment, back in this 1890s period, when the spiritual failures of the Enlightenment became something that people were concerned about. The Enlightenment was not achieving any kind of human fullness. And so people responded to that. And what came out of that was a whole body of new spiritual thought. And we'll talk about how that spiritual thought relates to Orthodox Christianity. But what's important is, if we want to understand the nature of that spiritual thought, we need to take it back to this original time and how it rejected the Enlightenment. And what's important about that is, to the extent that's its origin, there's a little bit of an apologetic cue there, because what it's saying is there's a lot of people who look at this body of scientific Enlightenment thought and they say it's inadequate. And there's a wide acceptance of that. That's an opportunity for Christians. So let's talk about the Enlightenment. What are we talking about? So the Enlightenment was this period 1650 to 1800. The West transitioned from this pre-modern period of superstition, and we all became enlightened. We all got past this whole notion of superstition. And with advances in science and religion, we disenchanted the cosmos. And in the process, Christianity transitioned from theism to deism to materialism, and God, in the words of Charles Taylor, God faded from view. So there was a process that went on during that period. So what's that about? Well, Taylor challenges, first of all, the notion that this was all because of science. He says, I look at this narrative that says science crowded out religion. I find it unconvincing. So why? Well, the first thing is, it ignores the fact that if you go back to those early scientists, Francis Bacon, Descartes, and many others, they still believed in God. They didn't see science as challenging their belief in God. In fact, they saw science as a way of fulfilling their understanding of how God had created this world, and it was intended to reveal who God was. So they didn't see science as crowding out God. Secondly, they'll say to you that science has proven that we live in a material world. It doesn't prove that at all. One of the whole points of Immanuel Kant's philosophy was, if you use human reason and apply it to that which we observe, if you get to the point of saying, does something exist beyond the phenomenal world, some non-material world, science can't tell you one way or the other. And this is, pretty much agreed with that. So you can't really draw the conclusion that science tells us we live in a material world. That was the point of my blog that says, is supernatural causation compatible with science? Of course it is, because there's nothing in science that says there isn't a supernatural world out there. And then here's an interesting one. He says, not only that, scientists boldly proclaim that they got these answers to truth, but they have their own leaps of faith. Origins of life we know about from Reasons to Believe, understanding consciousness, and there's this whole problem of determinism. Now, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the problem of determinism, but the idea of determinism is, if you really believe that we live in a material universe, that everything is material and it's governed by cause and effect, it leads you to the conclusion that we humans are, as Schaeffer would put it, machines. We're totally determined. Everything we do is predetermined by the makeup of our genes and by the way cause and effect works on us. Now you say that sounds like a crazy idea. Well, Einstein advocates that. And when you begin to probe people who advocate the scientific worldview, they all have to confront this question. When I teach my colloquium at Oregon State, I've got 12 honor students there, and we get to this question, and I'll say, how many of you believe in determinism? 4 or 5 hands will go up. Why do they go up? Because they're committed to a scientific worldview, and they understand that if they're committed to a materialistic scientific worldview, it's inevitable that they have to believe in determinism, even though it runs counter to everything we know about our life and about how we function. So what Taylor says is, this argument that science squeezed out religion is not very convincing. So what had to happen? He says, the problem is that narrative is so powerful, it's so compelling, it's so accepted as the narrative that it obscures what really happened. He says, what really happened is we were motivated by a new sense of self, empowered, autonomous, meaning on our own, no longer needing and no longer wanting a transcendent God. Well, what in the world does that mean, and how did that happen? Well, it begins by understanding what the world was like in this pre-modern period. And so he's got these sort of 1, 2, 3 items. And the natural world testified to a divine presence. And so in this pre-modern world, the sense of God was everywhere. Everything was understood as an act of God. God was implicated in the very existence of society. So God was present in the church, in the guilds, in our modern life. Everything was sort of implied. God is behind it. God is functioning in all of it. And it was sort of taken for granted that God was there and God was present. And it was spirit infested. So all kinds of non-human things were loaded and charged with meaning. Now, there's this quote that I love from Will and Ariel Durant in their History of Civilization, and they capture a sense of what that meant. The harassed poor lived in a jungle of superstitions. And so you can go through palmistry and portents and witches and goblins. And then he says there's this one book written in 1646. It required 652 pages to discuss the array of superstitions. Witches were being burned at the stake, 8,000 in Scotland alone in the period from 1560 to 1600. So this is an attempt to really, if you want to go back and sort of immerse yourself in what life was like in this pre-modern age, you have to think of it in these terms. You couldn't escape it. It was sort of taken for granted. And one of the things that defined that period is there was no boundary between the self and all of this spiritual world. We were porous. And so we were dependent upon it, had an influence on us. We defined ourselves in terms of the way these spiritual realities, the spiritual world impacted on us, upon these external transcendent forces. So Taylor argues that what happened as we went from this pre-modern period where we were porous to a modern period is we became buffered. Instead of having no boundary, there was now a boundary, which meant that we could isolate ourselves. We could be protected from the power and influence of these transcendent forces. Well, how did that happen? Well, one way it happened, as we know, is that science comes along and science basically starts to say that all of these things, volcanoes and other things, aren't acts of God. They can be explained in naturalistic terms. But a key figure in all of this is Descartes, philosopher, I think, therefore I am. And one of the things that Descartes concluded by starting with his method of doubt, by starting with the self, is he came up with this mind-body dualism. There's the mind and the body, and they're separate. They're disengaged. Well, it's one thing to say the mind is engaged from the body, but if you extrapolate that, it ultimately would mean the mind is disengaged from the entire material world. It's disengaged from the material cosmos. So we're up to that time, going all the way back to Aristotle. It was assumed that the cosmos had purpose. It was imbued with meaning from some transcendent source without defining what that was. Now that changes. Now we become disengaged. We become buffered. We become separated from the cosmos. Well, what happens to us as a self? All of a sudden, certain virtues, we think of ourselves as independent, as disengaged. And there's an ethic here. This is an ethic of independent self-responsibility. And not only that we're responsible, it also takes courage, because we have to stand up now and admit to the impersonality of the world. We have to be willing to refuse these comforts and consolations of an enchanted world, this sort of comfortable place where God is there. Well, God is no longer there. It takes courage to face that. We could now stand on our own, and you can sort of get a picture in your mind of a person maybe standing taller, thrust the chest out. I am on my own and I am strong. Well, what happens? What comes out of that? Well, one thing that comes out of that is the new self didn't need God anymore. It was strong. It was self-sufficient. I can live without God. I don't need God. Needing God is some prehistoric thing that was naive. It was mystical. I don't need God anymore. But not only that, I don't want God, because the Christian God becomes a barrier to our pursuit of humanity. And so what does that mean? Well, so you find in people like Pinker and other kinds of advocates of this Enlightenment worldview, to the extent that Christianity tells us that we should pursue a higher purpose that goes beyond the human life, it becomes a distraction. It actually draws us away from pursuing human flourishing in this life and recognizing that we were actually perfectible. We actually can do things on our own. And if we start telling people, you can't do it, you got to rely on God, that becomes a barrier to taking this view that we can really do it on our own. Not only that, God is offensive. We've got this identity, and now people are coming along in religion and they're saying, well, reason doesn't explain everything. Well, yes, it does. Not only that, Christianity has required submission to an all-powerful God. Well, I don't want to submit to an all-powerful God. I don't need God. Why do I want to do that? So under the pressure, so now you imagine that this is going on. You've got a new self. We enter this period of the Enlightenment. Things begin to happen. We begin to transition under the pressure of this new self, away from theism, where God is a personal agent acting actively in the cosmos, enters our lives, to deism, where now God is kind of standing outside. Maybe he created the world, but he's no longer engaged in the world. Once created, it's left to humans. We become co-partners with God, co-equals with God. I don't know how many of you remember the movie Oh God with John Denver and George Burns, where George Burns plays the part of God. And a lot of people, and I was sort of this way, I saw this movie and I thought, well, this is really neat. Hollywood is now coming out with this movie and it's telling everybody God really is there. But if you watch the movie and you understand the theology behind the movie, throughout the movie, George Burns passes this message on to John Denver, is you're on your own. I created the world. Now it's up to you. And it's basically a deist understanding. And it's a deist understanding that's very different from a Christian Orthodox view of the world. And then, of course, it's one small step from that to atheism. So how did this take place? Well, Charles Taylor actually describes it as happening through a series of what he calls anthropocentric steps, where God's goals shrink for us. This conversation by Taylor was very helpful to me because it helps to focus on what makes the Christian theology different, what makes Christian theism unique, what role does God have in our life that's unique to Christianity and to Christian theism? Well, one is we're called to higher purposes. We're called, once we accept Christ, to be sanctified, to be changed, to be made into individuals that are more Christ-like, not available to us and without the presence and power of God in our lives. We no longer need grace. So one of the themes of Christianity is we need grace both to empower us and to preserve us, to give us a atonement for our sins. Well, if we don't need God, we don't need grace. And so further, the idea that there's a further purpose out there starts to fade. The idea that grace exists starts to fade. Mystery fades because we can now understand the world through science. And he gets to this point where he talks about the order, to the extent that there is one, is impersonal. God is no longer an active participating agent. Final reality becomes an impersonal energy. So what does that mean? So you hear people talk about getting and raising their consciousness, becoming in contact with a higher plane of consciousness. Christianity believes in a personal God, which is very, very different from many forms of spirituality, which see final reality as some kind of impersonal source of energy, but not a being that I have to submit myself to, which is what Christianity requires. So this process goes on during the course of the Enlightenment. And again, this is one of my favorite passages from Will Durant. He's sort of characterizing. So if you're now in the late 1700s and you're living in this Enlightenment period where we're all now enlightened, we're all smarter, he describes the transition that had begun to occur. Now we've got the wrecks of faith laying in the wake of reason. The ancient God fell from his throne. Helvetius and Holbach made atheism so fashionable in the salons of France that even the clergy took it up. So you've got this massive, where's my thing? Here we go. Massive change going on. What comes out of that is a worldview. And this is not osmosis. It's not, oh, by the way, it sort of happens out there. We sort of believe these things. It's articulated. This is from a document, the scientific world conception that comes out of the Vienna Circle, philosophers and scientists who not only believe this, they want to advocate this. They want to say to the rest of the world, this is what you should believe as a kind of religion. So man has no supernatural protections. We can do it on our own. Mankind can change the conditions of life. We don't need God. And we have at our disposal the scientific method that can do it for us. We don't need God. So how does that express itself today? So here's some examples. This is Steven Pinker's book, 2018. Title of the book, Enlightenment Now, The Case for Reason, Science, and Humanism in Progress. Michael Shermer, How Science Makes Us Better People. This is a quote from Charles Taylor. Today, the presumption of unbelief has achieved a hegemony in the academic and intellectual life. And so, this is a quote from Alan Bloom. As for religion, the domestication of Christianity, Christian America, preserved the superstition of Christianity, overcoming of which was the key to liberating man. This is a quote from Edward O. Wilson. Look at this picture of this guy. He's kind of fatherly, sort of a loving guy, really a smart guy, evolutionary biologist. I found it, and he describes himself at the opening of his book as having been born a Southern Baptist and raised in the Fundamentalist Church. And then he says, I discovered evolution. I found it a wonderful feeling to be released from the confinement of fundamentalist religion. Science is a new and better tested ground to explain our universe and make ourselves better. What always interests me about this is I think of myself as I discover science, and science challenges my Christianity, and I lose my faith because of it. That's not a good feeling. Why is this for those people something that feels good? What is it about this that's positive? Well, what you find is this is waged as a kind of an evangelical zeal. They're going out and saying, this is a wonderful thing. Well, it's not because materialism was forced out by science. It's because there's a new self-identity that emerged that saw itself empowered and controlled and no longer in need of God. And it's that notion of self-pride that makes this something that is attractive to people, that becomes a source of evangelical zeal, if you were. And I just have a thought in my mind, recall the temptation of the serpent in the garden. What was the temptation? If you eat of the tree, the fruit of knowledge, you can become God. And I think there's a theme there that says, if you look through human history, there's an aspect of human history that humans want to displace God and they want to become God. So that sort of captures one half of this equation. What about the other half? So the other half is the spiritual half, and this is a part 2 to the story. So you go to the end of the 17th century, and what you find is all of this enthusiasm is out there for the Enlightenment and what a wonderful thing it's done for us, but there are some detractors. People are looking at this, very intelligent people, and you find, and here's a few names, Hamann describes the Enlightenment as having failed to capture I can't even read my thing here because this thing is in my way, capture the actuality of the palpitating actuality of, and I love that word palpitating, the sort of the throbbing heart of the real human. Immanuel Kant was fixated with determinism. Determinism can't be true because that's not who we are. And then you've got Herder, who is really the father of multiculturalism. So Herder goes out and looks at the world and he says, there can't be a single truth out there, which is what the Enlightenment demands. You've got all these different cultures, all these different values. Let's embrace them for what they are, cherish them for what they are, and not expect there to be a single universal truth. And then, of course, you've got Rousseau, who basically argued that the Enlightenment had suppressed the vitality of the inner self. So what comes out of this is a movement called Romanticism. So this is a quote from Isaiah Berlin. He's the roots of Romanticism, and this is how he describes Romanticism. It was a point of inflection in the whole history of Western thought, the largest movement to transform the life and thought of the Western world, the greatest single shift in the consciousness of the West to occur. All other shifts in comparison were less important. So the movement of Romanticism that occurred around the early 1800s, late 1700s, was a massive, massive shift in the way people think. Now, we think of this as a movement. So what was it about Romanticism? He talks about a shift in consciousness. Well, the shift in consciousness meant a shift in our focus from knowledge, from understanding the world outside of ourselves to understanding ourselves. It was a shift from an outer focus, an objective focus, to a subjective focus. We want to understand ourselves. We want to understand our emotion, our creativity, our intuition. Now, that wasn't new. There was a history of subjectivity in Western thought. Augustine said we should pay more attention to our inner selves, but always with the idea that it pointed to God. It was in relation to some external sacred order. What was new about Romanticism is it severed the self from external sacred orders. It basically said, we can look within ourselves for all truth, for all understanding, and for all spirituality that we want to find. So what happens when you do that? Truth becomes personal. Truth becomes what I see within myself. It's my truth is my truth, your truth is your truth, and there is no way to come to a common ground of what truth is, because truth is no longer anchored to anything apart from ourselves. Truth is entirely internal. So this is from Carl Trueman. Many of you may be familiar with Trueman. He wrote this book 2020, and he says, we now live in an age where the dominant culture rejects any transcendent sacred order. This is what he's talking about. The notion that we live in an age where we look internal to ourselves for truth, for who we are, for spirituality, disconnected from any notion that there's a transcendent sacred order that guides us and becomes an anchor for us in terms of what is true and what is not true. So to go back to this notion then of what was motivating this change, Taylor describes what he calls the malaise of modernity. Now, here's a really good one for us. He says there is a wide sense of malaise at the modern disenchanted world, a sense that is empty, flat, fails to respond to our humanity, and he describes it as a need to compensate for a sense of meaning that was lost when we severed ourselves from transcendence. And he says everyone understands this. Everyone understands the complaint that our disenchanted world suffers from a threatened loss of meaning. But what does that mean for us? If that's really true, think of what fertile soil that offers for us. If there really are people out there who are saying to themselves, I'm in this world, I know about science, but something is missing. What is missing? Well, that's a huge opportunity for Christians to enter that space. Well, thing is, what happened is, he summarizes this, the Enlightenment left no place for fullness of human life. So these are different ways of characterizing it. We aren't determined, so we're active creating people. We have something inside us that craves for something spiritual without be able to put our finger on it. And we know that things move us. Art moves us. Nature moves us. We know from that feeling that we have that there's something deeper in our existence, in our life, that science and the materialistic science just don't reach, just don't touch. So what happens? Well, here's the interesting point. Taylor says, we come to this point, the Enlightenment has all this enthusiasm, but on the other hand, you've got people looking at the Enlightenment and saying, well, it's really not answering my problems for me. But I'm still empowered. I'm still buffered. I'm still a new kind of self. And so because I'm a new self, I'm not really willing to solve that problem by going back to Orthodox Christianity. So they were unwilling to go back to the authority, the morality, and the universal truth. Three important words: the authority, true morality, and universal truth claims of orthodoxy. So they were unwilling to do that. So what do? They seek what he calls a middle way. And you can think of this in sort of a diagrammatically as you got Orthodox Christianity in one block, if you will. You've got this legacy of Enlightenment thought in another block. And over here, you've got a middle way that sort of is an attempt to find a space, a thought space that isn't Orthodox Christianity, but also isn't the legacy of Enlightenment. And I would argue that what came out of this movement of Romanticism was intended to fill that space. Now, the thing about Romanticism is it's not just about creativity, it was about art, it was about all these other things, but it was also, what was important about Romanticism was its spirituality. Now, this comes from a book by Richard Tarnas, The Passions of the Western Mind, and he tries to capture this sense of what he means by a romantic spirit and how central spirituality was to it. Now, you go through this list, it's pretty amazing. Transcendental idealism, Gnosticism, pantheism, Buddhism, a bunch of things I can't even pronounce, shamanism. I can't think of anything that's left off that list except Orthodox Christianity. And so this is what Schaeffer describes that as. He calls it a galloping pluralism on the spiritual plane. You've got all these different attempts to find spirituality, and he describes it as a supernova, just all kinds of opportunities out there, but not orthodoxy. So Tarnas goes on and he says, God was rediscovered in Romanticism but not the God of orthodoxy. So what distinguishes orthodoxy? What made orthodoxy not okay? What made all these other spiritual opportunities exciting, but not orthodoxy? Well, orthodoxy was anchored by a belief in an externally true God. Well, they don't want to accept the notion that there is an externally true God that's true, that's universal and true for everyone. It's a bit arrogant, they say. It's a bit arrogant for you to come out here and tell me that your God is the only God, that your God is externally true. And so it made orthodoxy appear spiritually intolerant. It included universal morals. Well, I don't know that I want to accept those universal morals. I'm guided by what feels right and wrong to me inside. As I look inside myself, if it feels good, do it. Right? Feels good, do it. So why should I bound myself to some universal morals that are constraining to my life? And here's a kind of a biggie: requires submission to the authority of a personal God. I don't want to yield to the authority of a personal God. My authority is in myself. So I want my authority to come from myself. So you start looking at all of the things that Orthodox Christianity imposes and commands and says, and all of a sudden Orthodox Christianity stands alone in the spiritual world. You've got the spiritual nova of all of these other things out there, and then you've got spiritual Orthodox Christianity. So I want to make the argument that this notion of Romanticism might have begun with this period during the late 18th, early 19th centuries, but it can be understood as a body of thought. There was something about that Romantic movement that when the Romantic movement itself died out, it carried on in other forms of thought, enough so that today it is a body of thought that exists in our culture as what I would call a spirit of Romanticism. So it began as a counter-enlightenment. It's expressed itself as a persistent protest against modernity. You hear the Bohemians, Thoreau, the hippies in the 60s. It was a movement in philosophy where you found in Nietzsche and Kierkegaard and Freud, all of them examining the significance of a subjective turn internally and what that meant and what that implied, and philosophically, what that led to in terms of how I ought to live my life. New emphasis on the self. So in our modern world, we now have, Charles Taylor calls it an ethic of authenticity. We should be our true selves. Robert Bellah refers to expressive individualism. We find who we are by being expressive and by acting out, what Carl Trueman calls the triumph of the self. And you've got the spiritual component, because part of the movement of Romanticism arises out of this emptiness. And so a common theme is a spiritual quest that was intentionally, as I just got through talking, intentionally counter-Christian orthodoxy. So I'm going to suggest that if you look at this thing that was called Romanticism, let's call it a spirit of Romanticism that has a lot of different faces. So it begins with the Romantic movement. You can add to that, it was called counter-enlightenment. So it saw the Enlightenment as dehumanizing, changed the Enlightenment's concept of universal truth, rejects the material universe. Today it expresses itself in postmodernism. It was a protest against modernity. Well, what was modernity? Modernity was the world created by a commitment to Enlightenment thought. So you got the Bohemians very early on. You got the counterculture in the 60s. You got in literature this body of thought that's an adversary culture. All of it is really saying that there's something wrong with modernity. And what's wrong with modernity is it's dehumanizing. And it's dehumanizing because of its roots in the Enlightenment. There's this notion of a subjective turn, which expresses itself in other ways. In art, which was a major part of the Enlightenment, they refer to subtler languages. So the idea there is art was an attempt to put on canvas senses that we have inside ourselves that you can't really articulate. There's this emphasis on authenticity, of expressive individualism. And then Carl Trueman's The Triumph of the Self. And then you've got the spiritual part of it, the human potential movement, New Age, all these different dimensions of what this nova, the supernova, looked like, and all the different ways it expresses itself. All of these, if you put them together, come together in what I would call a spirit of Romanticism. And it has, within that diversity, there's a unity. And the unity is the pursuit of truth by looking inside to the subjective self, severed from, disconnected from external orders. So there's no anchor that we can use to define a truth. and pursuing spiritual fulfillment through personal spiritual experiences. So today, people will say, I'm spiritual but not religious, and my spirituality is wherever I can find a spiritual experience that gives me a spiritual high. And whatever answers that for me, that's what I'm looking for. Well, put all that together, Charles Taylor has this comment toward the end. He says, here are three nodal points, he calls them, around which the swirling debates of our culture gather. So what does that suggest? It suggests we can look at our culture as a tension between three distinct and different ways of looking at the world. Orthodox Christianity is up there. You've got the legacies of the Enlightenment, and then you've got this spirit of Romanticism. So to define them, the Enlightenment legacy is what is marked by this commitment to reason, human autonomy, the pursuit of truth, and the progress through science. The spirit of Romanticism, which we've just been talking about, is marked by this turn inward to the subjective self, the pursuit of truth by looking inside ourselves, being disconnected from any external anchor that would give us a universal truth, and the pursuit of spiritual fulfillment through personal spiritual experiences. And then you've got Orthodox Christianity, defined by those truth claims that we talked about earlier, the creeds, the commitment to truth claims, most clearly articulated in the Apostles' Creed and the Nicene Creed, and the pursuit of spiritual fulfillment by transformation through the power of God and the power of the Holy Spirit in our lives. So if you paint this picture of what those tensions look like, I've got these arrows going back and forth. And so you look at the legacy of the Enlightenment, there's a tension there, but it presses against Christianity because it's counter-religion. It says there is no transcendent. You've got the spirit of Romanticism over here. It presses against Christianity in a different direction. It says we're opposed to orthodoxy. But here's the interesting thing. They press against each other. The Enlightenment thinkers aren't too happy with Romanticism, and they're very, very hostile toward it. Romantic thinkers are very hostile toward the Enlightenment. In fact, the whole Romantic movement was described as being counter-Enlightenment. So what does that do for us? To go back to the opening question, where does the battle rage? It answers that question for us. It gives us a framework to think about it. It gives us a way to think about where we are in our culture today and how to think about the responses that we have to these different pressures. And they're different. There's the pressure of coming from this Enlightenment side. There's one kind of an apologetic that makes sense there. And then there's this pressure that comes from the spiritual side, calls for a different kind of an apologetic. So let's go back to the 60s. How does this help us understand what happened in the 60s? So you recall that America was a very religious place in the 60s. So if you take that little diagram, what I'm suggesting is you got Orthodox Christianity and Enlightenment science. They were very mainstream. Spirit of Romanticism, I've described it, it's red, it was marginalized. You know, there was Thoreau, there was American Transcendentalism, there were some elements of that, and some of it had actually permeated the church in the form of liberal Christianity. But by and large, the dominant themes in pre-60s America were its commitment to Christianity and its commitment to science. And then you got this comment, overnight it seemed America had turned from God's country to a godless one. Bang, you've got the switch. So what's the nature of the switch? Well, Orthodox Christianity goes from being in the black, mainstream, to being in the red, marginalized. The spirit of Romanticism goes from being in the red, marginalized, to being in the black, mainstream. And so now in post-60s America, where you had pre-60s, you had 69% saying, yes, it's going to become more religious. Post-60s America, 14% is saying that, meaning referring specifically to Christianity. And now Christians, Orthodox Christians find themselves on the outs. They find themselves marginalized. And so our whole existence and our whole way of relating to the culture in a post-60s America is different from what it was in a pre-60s America. Well, one of the ways you measure that is in the wake of the 60s, you had this spiritual explosion, you know, New Age, Joseph Campbell, these books, Celestine Prophecy and Conversations with God, sold crazy. Shirley MacLaine's books on the New Age sold crazy. The human potential movement has become $1 billion industry. There was a new interest in Buddhism and in Hinduism. You had cults and communes, and liberal Christianity was still there because what makes that different? Liberal Christianity was not buying into the universal truth claims that we refer to in Orthodoxy. And so it was creating its own source of conflict for Christians. And so here's the important part there. All of those may be spiritual, but they're counter-Orthodox, which is to say, all of them advocate a spirituality that is alien to Orthodox historical Christianity, Christian truth claims, because they deny the truth claims that define us as Orthodox Christians. So then the question is, if that's where we live, how does that inform an apologetic? So that's what we want to talk about next week. End of story. And I'm open to questions.
Thank you, Paul. Wow, what a great history lesson and enlightenment, right? Thank you so much. Okay, so we are going to be continue to record this interactive Q&A. So if you have a question, you can either raise your hand or just speak out, unmute yourself, and I'll go back and forth there. So, all right, Ben, let's go.
Well, first of all, this is a great presentation, and I like how Doug described it. It was a fire hose experience. So thanks for this, Paul. This is really great. I love how you framed all this, and I have like lots of questions, but I'm actually going to ask the question that my wife just asked, which would be, how would you position in this framework sort of the revival movement that happened in the 70s in the United States? There was a tremendous revival. Where does that fit into this structure?
It's interesting you say that. When they talk about Putnam and Campbell, when they talk about the earthquake, they actually describe it as an earthquake followed by two aftershocks. And so the first aftershock was the revival that you talked about. There was a burst of new spirituality. And here's the interesting thing. They say that the growth in spirituality was unique to the evangelical part of the church. Why? Because the evangelical part of the church was standing up for basic truths in a way that other parts of the church weren't, and that drew people in. And so that was the first aftershock. But the second aftershock occurred as you get into the late 80s and you get into the moral majority and the emphasis on homosexuality and gay rights and so forth. And there was a falling away. So the second aftershock was what ultimately led to the rise of the nuns, which is what we're experiencing today.
I have a question.
Oh, I've got a question here, but before you do that, will the slides from this presentation be available? Anybody that wants them, just email me and I'll send you the slide deck.
I'll get them from you, and then I'll send it through the our website or our email list.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
So first of all, thank you, Paul, for the presentation. That was very enlightening. Within these tensions, a lot of the forces seem to come from outside Orthodox Christianity. Do you see forces within Orthodox Christianity that also fundamentally oppose what we're really all about as Christians?
Yeah.
And to that, I would say things like QAnon, false prophets, any type of supremacy of one race over another. Things of that nature seem to come more from inside.
So I would give you two responses to that. The first test is, how do they stand up to the basic truth claims that we defined at the beginning? We're sinners and so forth. And many of those claims, you find if you probe what they're saying things that just don't conform to that. But there's a second part of it that I think you're really getting at, is there's this circle that we want to draw around Christianity that says Orthodox Christianity is inside the circle because of truth claims that it holds. There's also professing Christians who are outside that circle. And so you can go back and you can see where Christians supported slavery, where there were Christians in Germany that supported Nazism. And so there are people who are professing Christians who are outside that circle. And I think dealing with that requires us to take a next step and begin to ask the question, what does Christianity teach us that goes beyond necessarily those 5 elements, one of which is the dignity of human life. Christianity teaches us that we're all created in the image of God, and that we all have this dignity that comes from having been created in the image of God. And if we don't treat people reflecting that respect for dignity, then we're outside the circle. So there are, I think, basic premises that come from these basic truth claims of who God is. And if you recall, one of those was we trust the authority of Scripture as God's way of revealing his truth to us. We have to look to what the Scripture tells us about how we're supposed to live and test some of these ideas against what the Scripture tells us about how to live. I agree with you that it's a different kind of set of questions. I don't believe, when I think about myself going out into my circle of friends and my networks, I don't run into QAnon. I don't run into anybody that believes slavery is okay. I run into a lot of people who will tell me, I don't know how in the world you can be a Christian if you're a scientist. And I run into a lot of other people who will say, well, I find my spirituality fulfilling in this way, and I don't need God. Those are the things that I run into. And so I'm emphasizing that in this approach, but I would agree with you. This is not, there's a lot more noise around it that you could add into it.
Thank you, Paul.
Paul, you want to
just-
stop sharing your slides and we can see each other a little bit bigger? Thanks.
Yeah. Good point. Okay.
Thank you very much. I just thought that was a brilliant presentation, to be able to squeeze so many details into comprehensible and understanding, easy to understand. No, not really easy, actually. So I want to understand and to see if I have really understood even some of the things that you've been saying. And I don't know how to express that. But if I tell you, when I'm listening to what you were talking about and my mind relates it to what is happening today, and if that is valid, then I think I might have understood what you were saying. And I do have one request at the end that I hope that you can very briefly explain to me again what is determinism. So to just give you very briefly the thoughts that I had when you were talking about Romanticism, I could relate it to today's US politics. They must be going through a period of Romanticism. And that was what you were, because of what you mentioned about truth becoming personal. And it's not based on anything objective. So that was my thought about Romanticism that I could relate to. And then the other, can I finish this? The other thing is when you talk, when you were talking about the middle way, and what I'm thinking about is progressive Christianity. Is that correct? So those are my thoughts.
All good thoughts. And let me just say that, I'm very respectful of the drinking from a fire hose aspect of this. This is a condensation of a class I teach that takes 15 weeks, 2 hours a week. So there's a lot to develop. Determinism is one of them. I probably spend an hour, at least half an hour on determinism alone. It's pervasive. It's hard to believe that people actually believe that. But the idea of determinism is that there's an article by Thomas Wolfe, 1996, called "Sorry, but Your Soul Just Died." And it's his characterization of what's going on in modern neuroscience. And he says, the younger generation accepts the notion that everything is determined right up to the point that I'm nodding my head at what you're saying. That was, when I was born, determinism would tell you that at this point in my life, I would be sitting in this room and nodding my head. And there's no place along the route where I would have been able to enter in and change the course of events because I have a free will. It denies free will. So it's just an incredible idea. And you're forced into it by accepting this materialistic view of the world, which denies the existence of a soul. So that's what it is. And the interesting thing for me is that when you read Pinker, when you read Shermer, when you read Edward O. Wilson, Samuel Harris talks about it, Daniel Dennett talks about it, they all ultimately confront the reality that determinism is a consequence of this materialistic scientific worldview. And for Francis Schaeffer, it was one of his strongest apologetic arguments. As for politics, what I would argue is Romanticism, the spirit of Romanticism has become normalized. That, I think, is a way that is a very common way for people to look at the world. And so truth has become more fragile. There's one comment here, all truth is relative and subjective. Well, actually, we know all truth is not relative and subjective. We know that that objective truth exists. But once you put yourself in a position where you're defining truth by what you find inside yourself and you disconnect yourself from any external anchor, it becomes relative and personal. And that's the problem. That's not true to who we are. I mean, ultimately, and I'll get into this next time, the most fundamental apologetic in response to all of these is they lead you to positions that are not true to who we are. They aren't true to our life experience.
Thank you. And so what about the middle way? Is that kind of equivalent to progressive Christianity today?
Yeah, so I've described the middle way as this whole spirit of Romanticism. Where does liberal Christianity fit into that? And I would argue that it fits into that middle way. And it fits into that middle way because ultimately, if you go back, and this takes you all the way back to the Auburn affirmation back in the 20s, what distinguished the liberal movement from the conservative movement was the insistence by liberals that they don't need to go by what the Bible says. I can follow my conscience. I can pick and choose what I believe to be true about spirituality based on what I feel, and I'm denying the authority of Scripture. So you got Marcus Borg, who says, I just don't believe in a personal God, but I'm still a Christian. And so you find within liberal Christianity this willingness to do that. Now, I had an interview with Joseph Claret at George Fox just this last week, and I asked him, where does liberal Christianity fit? And he called it a halfway house. He said it's a halfway house between this the spirit of Romanticism and Orthodox Christianity. And what he meant was, yes, they reject the truth claims of Orthodox Christianity, and it's an apostasy in that sense, but they still retain the cultural values of Christianity. They still try to cling to the sense of what it means to be Christian. So they have their churches, they talk about God, and it becomes something where it affects them culturally. So it's not, they're hanging on to a form of Christianity that isn't necessarily all the way over into the spiritual pluralism, and yet it lacks the emphasis on these truths. So in my view, that takes it down into this whole middle way. So I'm agreeing with you that I think the right way to understand progressive Christianity is to put it in that middle space.
Yes, that explains it very well. And the reason why I asked this question is I'm finding that I'm meeting more and more so-called Christians. And then when I talk to them, I realize that there's something not right about it. And sometimes I start to doubt myself because they talk about it in a way where it makes them very open-minded, and we are not. And
yeah,
and
that's
it's
really,
quite
yeah.
I don't know, unsettling.
That's really excellent, because that's part of their attack. Their attack against Orthodox Christians is they say we're closed-minded. And so I guess what I would argue is that when you look at where the battle rages, there's one battle with scientists, there's one battle with this kind of broad sense of spirituality, but there's another battle that's specific inside the church with what you've called progressive, what I would call progressive liberal Christianity. So John, you've had your hand up for a while.
Hey, hello. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Thanks, bro. Oops, let me see if I can get situated. Thanks so much for the talk there. As I was kind of like thinking through some of the things you said about the buffered environment that we live in, I couldn't help but think of like Sean Carroll, right, of Caltech fame, right, kind of discussing when he would talk to his fellow non-believers and kind of like asking about maybe for example, what time actually is, right? Or when they're kind of working, kind of trying to discover or talk about the essential nature of reality, and how so many of them would just default to a spirit of pragmatism by saying, hey, you know what, these calculations, they work. Like, why bother trying to figure out, you know, the meaning or trying to address that? And I was just kind of considering kind of like in a similar vein, right? It really doesn't, we just have so many modern conveniences available to us today. It doesn't matter if you're irrational, right? You're going to be able to put your key inside the car and kind of start your car and just go about your day. And so I can kind of just see that kind of just so many things really kind of enable this buffered thought so that we don't have to think about this transcendent God that made all this possible.
Yeah, and I think what Taylor's saying is that enough? Is there something inside us that says, okay, I hear that, but I need more? And I mean, that was how Romanticism arose, is because people looked at that and said, it's not enough. Yeah.
But clearly for many it isn't, right? Because even Sean Carroll himself is like, no, this is maddening, right? I want to interact with others to talk about these fundamental things, but then it seems like for a certain, you know, segment of the population, right, it's enough of a salve to ignore, right, and you know, potentially not address.
Well, people have to come to God because they want to.
Yeah.
You know,
Romans 1, right?
Yeah, I think Tim Keller is the one who says, before you believe, you have to want to believe.
Thanks again, brother.
Okay.
All right, let me just jump in. Lisa, you had a comment or a question on the chat. Is there a better term or definition of religion to expose the fact that each mode of thought or set of ethics are all religions?
Yeah, religion is sort of a funny term. When Schaeffer, I keep wanting to say Schaeffer, when Taylor talks about religion, what he tries to define is, he calls it a spiritual moral space that we all reach for. And religion, broadly speaking, is our effort to get in touch with that religion, with that spiritual moral space. And yet when people talk about I'm spiritual but not religious, they mean something different by religion. And so in that sense, I think what they're referring to by religion is what we would call orthodoxy. So religion can mean orthodoxy, or it can mean more broadly just the spiritual hunger for something more. So you got to be careful how you use it.
All right, Doug, you want to ask your question?
Yeah, great talk, by the way. Several questions on my mind, trying to prioritize. One of them is that you mentioned, and I think it was mentioned elsewhere, that you're teaching a class in apologetics at George Fox. You mentioned, or somebody mentioned, that you might be willing to share your slides. If you have like a syllabus for that course that you're willing to attach with that and send that out, that might be handy to see what you typically do in these classes. That would be really great. Is that, and I guess the next question is, do you plan to teach that class again anytime soon? That was one. And one more, if I may, I was just going to make a comment about determinism, that a lot of that has to come from at least from physics, actually, specifically Laplacian views of the world, where everything's the grand machine. And I, you know, having spent a great deal of time myself studying physics, I have to say that view is, although there are people who still hold it, a lot of even classical mechanical systems are often extraordinarily sensitive to initial conditions, and to the point where you're no longer able to use classical methods to define the initial conditions. And, you know, they're so finely divided that you really are in the quantum regime, and quantum mechanics is fundamentally not deterministic. It's fundamentally probabilistic. So the argument from mechanics, from physics, that we live in a determined universe, which some of these sociologists seem to want to appeal to, isn't even founded in physics anymore. So I just couldn't resist making that comment. But anyway, thank you.
Actually, I have a counter view to that, I do think that even in a quantum mechanical world, you find that science leads you to determinism, which is partly, you see it in Einstein, who took the view that, I mean, he certainly understood quantum mechanics, but he took the view that we live in a determined, and he said, if you don't accept that we live in a determined universe, you don't understand science. That was kind of what he said. So I'll tell you what I'll do in addition to these slides. I'll send out the material that I've got on determinism, which you might, find of interest. And you can form your own judgment. You kind of say, yeah, I'm crazy. No, I'm not crazy, but you might find it. And if you think I'm crazy, I'd want to hear your responses.
Yeah, quantum foundations is hotly debated. So there are some that take your view, but there's quite a bit of studies of things like Alan Aspect and so on about quantum foundations that really call the notion of determinism in the quantum mechanics into question. So discussion for another day, however.
Fair enough.
Hey, Gary.
Hey, thank you for your talk. I guess my comment is I'm looking forward to where you take this. The chart in particular that drew my attention most was the huge scatter plot of just the wide array of weird directions that the history of thought in the last couple centuries has taken us. And so as an apologist, with the goal of leading somebody eventually to some idea of Christian truth, once you've broken down those barriers, it just seems overwhelming. So I'm looking forward to see how you develop this into, is it an apologetic or a tailored one for every single person on every one of those little bubbles?
Well, it's not. I'll say it's not going to be the perfect apologetic. I would rather say it's some thoughts about how to approach apologetics in this age that we live in.
Nice. Looking forward to it.
Ben, you said you had a bunch of questions. Did you want to ask him?
Sure. Here's how I'll pose this question. You mentioned a couple really key areas where today Orthodox Christianity is being denied: determinism, problems of consciousness, and so I've become more and more interested about the whole notion of consciousness as an area that is increasingly being studied, especially in light of artificial intelligence. So I'm wondering if you see artificial intelligence and the movement that is happening today as a good vehicle to argue for immateriality and what then follows into Orthodox Christianity. Let me rephrase that. What impact do you see artificial intelligence having on our apologetic?
Well, so I'll answer it this way. I can't give you my answer off the top of my head, but what I will say is that Reasons to Believe had a seminar on consciousness and artificial intelligence as part of their whole idea of humanism 2.0. And J.P. Moreland had a really great talk on consciousness. So a lot of my thinking on consciousness, and he talked about consciousness and how artificial intelligence doesn't solve the problem. And in fact, artificial intelligence is trying to fill a hole that it can't fill because there's a dimension of consciousness that artificial intelligence cannot cover. So what this is all also from a book I'm writing on Legacies of the Sixties. So when I talk about consciousness in that book, a lot of what I talk about is drawn from that presentation from J.P. Moreland on the issue of consciousness. And I think if you go back to the Reasons to Believe website, I'm sure you'll be able to find something about that. But that's where I would point you on the issue of consciousness.
Yeah, I'll just put forth a proposition just for the rest of us to think about. And I've been thinking more and more just in a shorter time frame of historical development, especially as science has spoken into Orthodox Christianity. And it feels to me like, just generally speaking, we've had some decades where cosmology has been the main source of informing and supporting and corroborating the Christian worldview from a origin of the universe standpoint. Then we had some decades where the focus was maybe more in the biological sciences, discovering the workings of a designer in biology. I feel like we might be on the cusp of another set of decades that will be really focused on this whole, effort, this whole project of artificial intelligence, in that pushing into that world is going to, again, reveal fundamental truths that then affirm Orthodox Christianity, specifically the challenge to try and create this sense of consciousness that we're going to be driven to try and understand that better and in a deeper way than we ever have. So I'm just kind of like leaning forward, anticipating, we did cosmology, we've done, we're doing biology. Wow, now we're doing artificial intelligence. I look forward to what that's going to do to, again, give us great reasons to believe in Christianity.
Yeah, I think that's very much in the spirit of the emphasis that you find from Fuzz Rana and Ken Samples on this whole notion of humanism 2.0. That's where that whole conversation leads, and they've had a couple of different seminars on the subject. I think they would agree with you.
Go ahead, John.
So I had a comment also. Then I was really heartened to see the slide there. I'm saying how science as an explanation in the Enlightenment wasn't what drove away kind of this fleeing away from Christianity. And again, it's just so consistent with how so many of the early scientists, right, were all believers as well. So I really kind of appreciated that even Taylor calling that out and kind of like challenging that standard story.
Yeah, good.
Cool. Yeah, I was encouraged. I mean, at the point, there was a little bit of hopelessness, at a point, like, what can we do? I'm kind of like with Gary, what can we do now? But I appreciated your statement, that this is fertile soil for Christians, Orthodox Christians. And I am definitely looking forward to the approach that you're going to share with us on July 9th and such. But yeah, looking forward to that. Anybody else have any other questions or comments?
Thanks for pulling it together. That's a lot to distill, and appreciate it.
I'll just second Belinda's optimism here. I think that, Paul, you've really laid out some key things, and I'm looking forward to how we identify the common points where we can latch into in those opposing worldviews and draw people, acknowledge why people are being attracted either to the Enlightenment side or to the spiritual side, but then latch onto those and draw them into the truth there at the top. So yeah, exciting stuff and great topics to initiate those conversations.
Good.
Cool. Yeah, do you have any other comments that you want to share with us, Paul?
No, I really appreciate this. This has been a great exercise for me, because taking 15 weeks and distilling it down into an hour, I know it's a fire hose, And I don't know how to avoid that, but it was really helpful to me because it forces me to step back and say, what's the essence of what I'm talking about?
Yeah,
I can
nice.
get tied
Right.
up in the weeds just like everybody else can. And so this helped, pull me out of it. So it was a really good exercise for me. And I just want to say again, Belinda, you guys may not appreciate how much better that was because of Belinda's work on me in in fixing some of the slides. So she was a great help, and I'm really appreciative of that.
Thank you, Paul.
I just want to add one more comment that I was thinking about when I was listening to Paul, and that was as he was describing each period one after another. I could relate to it because it's like something that I've gone through my whole life, the different stages of being a very, very innocent and naive believer as a child, and then progressing to not being able to really accept the faith, and then went through a period of enlightenment, and then Romanticism, and then finally back to trying to be Orthodox, but ending up with meeting a lot of progressive Christians. So it is actually very meaningful to me. So thank you very much. It was such a brilliant presentation. That's all I can say.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. Yeah, I think, with the Portland chapter, we are really focusing on, gaining knowledge, seeking knowledge, which you have definitely given us today. But in addition, it's the seeking wisdom, understanding. And you have helped us by looking back in the history, to help us inform where we are presently. And then our next point is like seeking wisdom, like how we can then apply it and when and with who. So we appreciate that. Seeking knowledge, seeking understanding, and seeking wisdom. So thank you again very much. I want to honor everybody's time. I want to remind you that his second part is on July 9th, same time. Yeah, if anybody would like to stay, I'll leave the Zoom open for a while, and you can stay as well, Paul, and we can just chat. So yeah, thank you everybody for joining us, those who are here with us now and those who are watching online in the future. All right, thank you all.